Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones, alongside Managing Editor Moriah Richard and Michael Woodson. If you've checked out our September-October issue of the magazine, you'll know that it's themed around sinister stories, and Tiffany D Jackson is our cover interview for her new YA horror novel, The Weight of Blood. We were so taken with the novel and the story it told that we had to keep chatting. We wanted to talk more about it and talk to Tiffany again. So we are pleased to announce The Weight of Blood as our next book club pick. And today we're thrilled that Tiffany D Jackson is here to talk all about it. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to talk to you again.
Yes.
So I wanted to start with the basics. If you could give listeners a brief synopsis of the story, just in case they haven't read it yet.
Sure. So The Weight of Blood is basically my homage to Stephen King's Carrie. It is set in 2014 in a fictional city of Springville, Georgia. And it's about a girl named Maddie who has been passing for white at the behest of her very fanatical father until a surprise rainstorm exposes her darkest secret and leads her classmates to, torment her. And the moment goes viral, and some of the classmates, worried about the school looking racist, decide to host their first integrated prom. But some of their classmates are not interested in changing traditions, so they have one more trick up their sleeve for Maddie, but what they don't know is Maddie has another dark secret that's going to cost the entire town their lives.
I feel like that is, we always talk to writers about creating like a great synopsis that will really capture people's interest, and you're an expert at that.
Yeah.
That was perfect.
I have to give it up to my film background, honestly, because filmmakers, we have to give that elevator pitch and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So honestly, that's the only way I'm able to even write books or think about write books.
So you mentioned that this was an homage to Carrie, Stephen King's book, which I will admit I have not read. But so what sparked the idea for writing this story at the beginning? Is this an idea you had in the back of your head for many years, or did something in the news spark the interest in writing it?
So actually, yes, an event back in 2014 at a school in a small town in Georgia, they were hosting their first integrated prom. And I remember CNN had covered it, and they did a little mini doc on it. And for some background, because people were this happened in 2014. Basically, some towns in the South, in specific areas, they still host prom, segregated prom. So they have their quote black prom and white prom. And the only way they're able to get away with that is because the prom is not a school function event. It's a community-based event. And so the community were still upholding the tradition they had even when the school first integrated. And I remember working at the time and watching this whole news story about this school and saying and watching all the people that they were interviewing, and all of them kind of saying yeah, we don't really want to change tradition. We're only doing this because the cameras are here. We'll probably go back to, what it was, as soon as you guys leave. And I was how wild it is to see people hold on to those type of ideologies. They have no problem looking completely ass backwards and racist. And I thought it was really interesting. And I'd been thinking about how do I bring this into a story? And I think at one point, many years later, I was talking to someone about how Carrie was my favorite, horror film at the time. And I was man, I wish there was a way I could, and I stopped talking and I was oh yeah. So that's how the idea came about.
Tiffany, you are our closing keynote speaker at the WD annual conference this year, and you mentioned this was the first book you'd written in third person.
Yes.
So I'm curious, how was the writing process different for you, in doing this? And for our listeners who maybe want to play with different perspectives and are maybe nervous to try it, what advice do you have for them?
I would say, because I'm very much a first person type gal. I've been all the stories I've ever written were always like first person. And because I like being in like the character's head and thinking about, everything. And one of the things I realized I had to do was read a lot of mentor text that was already in third person to sort of like get into the groove of understanding what that would sound like. And so it was a tricky transition for me, but I made sure that I read a lot of books, specifically like long, like fantasy books that were all in third person and all great at world building. Because one of the best things about doing things in third person is you're able to sort of set a larger scene. And so that was one of the biggest things that I was trying to do, was to make sure that I focused on like what everything would look like and be able to kind of get that bird's eye view that I don't typically get in first person. And a lot of horror writers will tell you, and I didn't realize this is my second horror novel, and I'm realizing now that writing horror in third person is much easier than in first person, because third person allows you to sort of like play with like the monster, seeing things from the monster's point of view, or seeing things that the character doesn't see, so you're like tense and like, oh my god, they don't see this coming. So I think it's all about kind of like getting into the groove of that mentor text.
Tiffany, you and I talked a little bit about this during our conversation back in May, but I think one of the most interesting things that you do with your books, and especially with The Weight of Blood, is that you utilize excerpts from kind of these third-party perspectives. So, for example, specifically in The Weight of Blood, we get podcasts and interviews and excerpts from true crime books. And I feel like those really capture this idea of like how a story changes from when it's been told for the first time. And it really struck me as I was rereading this, because a large part of the like spark of this book is that viral nature of, oh no, the world is looking at us and we need to change our behavior accordingly. So can you speak a little bit more about what attracts you to including those elements in your story, and how it might have been different this time around because the story was already being told in third person?
Yeah. So I love using mixed media. I'm a mixed media gal through and through. This is actually a huge, The Weight of Blood is actually a huge callback to my first novel, which is Allegedly. And Allegedly had a lot of excerpts and transcripts and stuff from like the case as well too, and not necessarily a podcast. So I wanted to take the opportunity to try that. I love podcasts. I love kind of getting those nitty gritty details. I'm like a huge research nerd at heart. So podcasts really those are my jam. So to be able to kind of call back to sort of like that opportunity to sort of give a broader lens of what's happening in the story, I wanted to take that chance. And especially because I think, one of the best things about writing thrillers and horrors and stuff like that is getting a reader really involved and making them feel like they're a part of the case or a part of the mystery. And that's like one of the best ways to do that is through like podcasts and mixed media, to make them kind of like think on their own. It's a great way to sort of like, I call like save the saggy middle, because you don't have to info dump. I'm not big on info dumping. I'm not big on like, I rather like it be, if we do have to info dump, we're doing it in a creative way, in a very succinct way. And so there were times where you learn a lot about, like, let's say Maddie's father, and, a podcaster kind of read, an excerpt from a book, and it was like a paragraph, and and you basically learn everything you truly need to know about this man without actually having to sort of like go through the motions. And so it helps with the pacing. It helps sort of like kind of move things along, and like, okay, we know about this guy, right now what? So I think that that's one of the best ways that I can say that. Do I think everyone should use podcasts? No. And I think there are a ton of other creative ways to sort of like give that sort of character development, but this is just something that I sort of lean towards, especially being like a thriller horror writer.
And I think one of the things you talked about in that interview with Moriah was it also helps when you like end a chapter on a cliffhanger and then you jump to that excerpt from something. You're like, I've got to keep reading because I need to know what just happened. But you get that breathing room to like internalize the cliffhanger as well. Like as like a writing tool, I love that. It just made me want to keep flipping the pages.
I didn't realize I was doing that in all of my books until I had an event with R.L. Stine, I think last summer, the summer before last. And, I was his moderator, and I was kind of like, and someone in the audience asked, like, how do you keep people like reading? And he said, end every chapter with a cliffhanger. And as someone who like read R.L. Stine growing up like incessantly, I didn't realize I completely adopted his whole swag. And so I don't like, and it was a Zoom, and my whole mouth dropped, and I was just like hearing him say this, and I was like, like that's one of the best things about like mentor text, right? Is you could sort of understand the way people tell story and like make it your own, like put your own spice into it. So one of the things that I do is try to end everything on some type of cliffhanger and give you that like that breathing room in a sense of a podcast or something to kind of like take your mind away from it, but also like you're still like buzzing, like, no, I need to know like what's happening here. Some people actually in reviews were kind of like, oh, these podcasts, I couldn't read them fast enough. I was just trying to get to the story.
Wow.
I know. I think they added so much, because like you said, they get that information in there, but they also hint at what's to come. So it's like
totally
it follows the cliffhanger, but then it's its own cliffhanger too, because you want to know what are they referring to? How did they get that information?
And I think for me, like, especially when we're talking about young adults and today's young adults, like, I think there is this like really important thing we have to keep in mind that like they're growing up online and they're being viewed in ways that might not be necessarily true to who they are. And they're kind of learning a performance. And so like, I think it's so important, especially you spoke a little bit about allegedly, and that one I think had the same kind of weight to this as in The Weight of Blood, where how I was experiencing the character was not exactly aligned with how these third-party elements were discussing them. And then I kept saying to myself, these are kids. These are young people, and you're talking about them as if they are a case study, as if there's something to be looked at and judged on a different scale. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind especially I feel when we're talking about horror and thriller, which can have heavier, darker themes.
And there's always that like element of, I find that when I talk to a lot of kids about like stories and stuff like that, there's always this element of like feeling they're misunderstood. And so it's always fun to kind of like see things from their perspective, i.e. like Maddie and in The Way to Blood, but then you get this like adult perspective and like, they completely missed the mark. And it sort of like aligns with the idea like, sometimes people aren't going to understand you, but you still have to live in your truth. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that I like tell kids is like, adults get it wrong too. And I think it's important to show that adults aren't perfect human beings and, allow them to understand that as you grow, you're still growing. I mean, I'm a whole super senior at this point in my life. And so I think it's important to understand that you are a continually evolving human being, that, it's not like you don't turn perfect as soon as you turn 18. And I think there's this misconception that, adults don't make mistakes and stuff like that. So I think that's important for us to, kind of give them that like perspective, like, adults are looking at you and be completely wrong about who you truly are. And that doesn't invalidate your feelings and invalidate your experiences.
So you mentioned Maddie and like knowing who you are. So I want to talk about her for a little bit, because when I picked up the book, again, I hadn't read Carrie, so I had no background for the inspiration or the homage part of it. But I kind of expected Maddie to know that she was passing as white, and that she was in on that secret a little bit.
Yeah.
And then
Yes.
in some ways she knew she had a secret, but she didn't really know what that was. What made you choose to have her not know her history? And when did you know that that was the right choice for the novel? Or like, was there ever a draft where you kept her in the dark for longer?
I think ultimately she knew that she was Black, or that she, was biracial. But I think the issue was, she experienced, like, through her father, who's sort of like, hammered into her that this is a bad thing for you to be and that you need to keep this dark secret. And she even at one point in the novel experiences or sees someone else experiencing things in a wrong way, or she was tormented, and she was like, if I'm tormented just being, like, quote unquote white, what will they do to me if they actually knew the truth? And so it became this obsession in a lot of ways for both Maddie and her father to keep this dark secret. And I think it really calls back to, there were so many African Americans who passed as white, during, the Reconstructive era, and even further, because they were at some point trying to look for a better life and better opportunities. But if when you know that you are something else, and that, you could be killed for doing the things that you're doing, like killed for, like, sitting in like an all white restaurant, or, a whites only, or drinking out of a whites only fountain, you just live in this chronic fear. And so that's one of the things I knew I wanted to focus on, is the chronic fear that Maddie was feeling at all moments during her entire, like, existence. And that was something that I wanted to sort of expound upon, because the idea of passing is incredibly frightening. There is something inherently, or I want to say there's something like just incredibly terrifying about the moment, about like your decision to, like, pass as a white person and, like, maybe marry a white man who doesn't actually know your history, and then still bear children, and you're worried about they may actually not look like you. There is so much fear in that, and that is something that Maddie truly experienced throughout this novel. But then when she did sort of, like, when she was exposed, i.e. her hair got wet, and her classmates, like, instantly knew, there was denial there at some point, like, from her father. It was trying to, like, pretend like, none of this ever existed. But then she started to, like, question. She started to, like, kind of, like, think about it and be like, well, hey, like, what would happen if I was Black? And her, it became a moment of her starting to explore that Blackness, but still being, like, fearful of it as well too, because she didn't know, quote unquote, how to be Black.
Well, and that kind of connects to another thought that I had, that's not necessarily a question, but I also read White Smoke recently, one of your other novels. And in both that book and The Weight of Blood, like, the adults try to keep these teens from finding out, like, critical information about themselves, about the town. And, for whatever reason, they're trying to, like, protect the kids, or they just don't want the secret coming out. They don't want bad publicity. But the kids always find out the truth. Like, they always know how to use the tools at hand. And in this case, it's, the internet. If they want to know something bad enough, they will find a way to figure it out. And I love that is presented in both of those books.
I mean, because that's ultimately a thing that happens in real life. Like, kids always will always have, like, and, like, their instincts are much sharper than ours. Like, they know when something is wrong, and they know when something is up. They have, like, this, like, inherent energy about them, because I guess they're, like, very much a raw palate, in a way. And I think that they pick up on things, and they may not know what it actually is. And so one of the things that I feel strongly about is to not keep kids in the dark, to sort of, not completely expose them to everything, but to sort of allow them to have an understanding of it. And that's one of the things that I don't feel like we should like sugarcoat shit to make it easier for them to swallow. We should have them actually like have an understanding of the way like the world works, or the way the world can be truly unfair to other people. And that would hopefully make them more compassionate humans, leading to a better society overall.
Amy just mentioned like a town's history, and you at the beginning mentioned that this is a fictional town, and I think that it just feels so real and tangible and deeply atmospheric in a way that like is so important to the success of this story. And I just want to know, like, how did you, I guess, like put yourself there in a place where like I think it leads to sort of like the podcast parts and the other interview parts that make this town feel genuinely real, that like I found myself Googling it to be like, did she visit this place? But I'm just curious, like, how do you pull out those details and then enrich the story from the place that they're living?
So to be honest, I didn't, I went to high school in a semi-small town. I went to high school, up, in Westchester, like in Cortland Manor area. My parents live, in Buchanan, which is right near Indian Point. So there is a power plant right there. So I knew what it was like to live near a power plant. So that was like one sort of like tidbit. But I really didn't know anything about like small town, like true small town living. So it was a lot of like research that had to like happen. Hilariously, I know nothing about like sports towns. Like I know nothing about like Friday Night Lights. So I ended up like watching the whole series to kind of have an understanding of how important like, high school football is to an entire town. I was like, why are they worried about like high school football? Like, why is like the gas station guy like talking to the coach? Like it was really like, I had to get a crash course in like football in general. To understand like that aspect. So it was a lot of research and like kind of compiling a town into what I like from that research into what I believed what would be like kind of sort of the elements of that. And then specifically, like in Black history, we also have like, we know about sundown towns where like, you cannot be out and about or in that town after sundown. And so a lot of us know sort of like those restrictions. So I was able to kind of add that sort of element to it where, this town also had that history. And therefore it played a huge dynamic into the way the community worked together, where there was this understanding like, yeah, we get along, but at a certain point you need to go back to on the other side of the tracks and, stop fraternizing, or like, yeah, our school is integrated, but you don't belong here. So a lot of people have had that experiences. So, being able to really kind of take that and develop that into this one town, like taking bits and pieces from different people's towns, was the only way I was able to sort of like create this, which, I gotta give it to like a lot of like the world building that I've been reading in some fantasy novels and some like, even like old Stephen King novels, like having that like, mentor text and knowing how to really like plant a character in a place that actually like the place is its own character in a way, is definitely truly important to the writing process.
Yeah. So in the interview that you did with Moriah for the magazine, I want to talk about the ending a little bit.
Okay.
You talked about the ending of this book being like bloodier and gorier than your other books and not wanting to disappoint young Tiffany. And considering like whether young Tiffany would say this is corny about your book. And I was wondering about that because like the older I get and the more removed I get from myself as a teenager, I feel like the less I trust myself to know what I would have thought about something, compared to like how teens would react to something nowadays. Do you ever worry about that potential disconnect when you write, or do you have like ways of working through that with like beta readers who are teens, or does your publisher help with that in some kind of way? Or are you better connected than I am?
I think these last couple of years of the pandemic has really definitely disconnected me a bit, because before I used to be in schools. One of the biggest tricks that when everyone asks me like, how do you like get a teen voice? I always say like, I live in Brooklyn and I ride the subway. I literally ride the subway from like 2 to like 4. And all you have to do is overhear like every single conversation. My apartment building is within walking distance of 3 high schools. Like I see teens all the time. So that's basically the biggest way to kind of like keep that. And plus I still do like school visits. I travel around the country. I talk to people. So the pandemic really put a big halt on that, because I wasn't seeing kids. I wasn't even seeing kids like on the train anymore. And so I felt like a huge disconnect and, suffered some like pretty hard writer's block, which I never had before. So I will say that one of the ways that I sort of still like get back to young Tiffany is thinking about like going back to some of the movies I used to watch. And like kind of remember some of those emotions I was having, like, or like reading something that I had like questions about and didn't have like the specific answers at the time. And it wasn't like a time to actually ask those questions. So even like, definitely like my first book, allegedly, that talked a lot about like girls in prison. And I never had those answers when I was a teenager. No one really kind of talked about it. It was sort of like hush hush, and no one like, dove into like, the nitty gritty of it. And then for The Weight of Blood, I thought about like, going to proms and being what it would be like to, be an interracial kid. And like those, like, I always had those type of questions. So being able to like go back and like sort of dive into that and explore that and read texts that talk about that, I was able to answer a lot of my own questions. So a lot of times, like, I will sit back and like watch, like, I feel like I watched a movie called, recently that was, I didn't realize how problematic it was. This movie called Not Without My Daughter, with Sally Fields. And it's a really old movie, and it's based on like a book. And the movie was just a little like I had so many questions. I remember watching it when I was so young with my grandmother that I went back and watched it, and I was kind of thinking about it again, about like the idea of like being so passionately a passionate mother. Because when you're a kid, you're just kind of like, why don't you just leave her? Like, bye. Like save yourself, girl. But now that I'm an older woman, like, I don't have a child, but I have a dog. I can see myself saying like, yeah, I couldn't imagine leaving my dog somewhere, or my child, so my niece or my godson anywhere. Like, so there is something to be said about going back to previous works or previous things that you loved, that you remembered, and kind of exploring that inner child again. Because that's a lot of the things that I don't think a lot of young adult authors realize, that they're actually just kind of writing to their inner child and answering questions for their inner child. And it's unpacking things, it's exploring things. It's like we're doing our own little therapy in a lot of ways.
That's such an interesting way to look at it. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, even though like I'm a young adult writer, I have a huge adult fan base.
Sure.
A lot of adult women read my books, and they're always asking like, when are you going to write for adults? And I was just like,
I already am.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And it's like, I already do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you all are reading it, and it is satisfying something in you that you never got a chance to really explore yourself. Because we didn't have books like mine, or like, Donald Clayton's or Jason Reynolds. Like we never had these type of books when we were growing up. We didn't have books that really talked about like real issues that like spoke to us. We didn't have books that like really described like where we were living at the time. I definitely didn't see myself on the page ever, which is one of the reasons why I turned to horror in a lot of ways, because it was the only kind of like genre that gave me like just a glimpse at like the tension I was living through like at the time. So I think that when everyone's saying like, oh, when you're gonna write for adults, I'm like, you already are feeling it. You already like, you needed this and you didn't even realize it. And you like identify with these characters, and they're 16, 17. Like take a moment to think about that. and understand, like, you know, you still have, so we all still have some growing to do. And so just recognize the fact that it's okay to not feel like, quote unquote, embarrassed that you're reading this book that like doesn't seem like it's for you, but it's 1,000% for you.
Mm-hmm.
Jason Reynolds is the love of my life. Just had to put that on the record.
Yes, I
understand. You do something in The Weight of Blood that I think is like exceptionally hard to pull off, which is that, okay, this is kind of ending, but not really. It's not really spoilery. You do it throughout the book. There are certain characters that survive the incident well before we get to prom, and we get to know that as the reader, like through like the podcast interviews and such. But knowing that they survive doesn't take away from the tension at all. And like, because it's kind of in a weird state of reading where you're like, knowing that they survived doesn't mean that they were like out of harm's way or that they weren't affected in some way.
Right.
And so you're still very tense wanting to know what happened. How did you decide which characters to incorporate in both what's going on in 2014 and also with Michael and Tanya trying to figure it out in their present day, I guess?
I think I've always been in love with books that sort of like kind of spoil the ending in the very beginning, because despite knowing what's going to happen, you still want to know how it happened.
Right.
And so that was like a big thing for me, like in this book, is that I want to tell you everything that happened real early. Like even the first page, is like an excerpt from the podcast. And it literally says like, you know, basically everyone is dead. And so, so there's no surprises. It's like, but it's more like how it happened. And that's like kind of the journey is like the best part. Right. So I think one of the ways I wanted to make sure that the story sort of like lived is to not have every evil person or every problematic person in the book die, because then there would be no lesson there. And I also wanted to like, you know, explore kind of like real life, like this, like sort of like paint this also for kids, is to also know like, yeah, there's going to be people who are going to survive, like the good guys are going to die. Like some good guys are going to die, and then there's some who are going to live, and it's not fair, but you know, how else will we find out about those stories? And I think it's unrealistic to sort of like, you know, oh, the villains are dead and then like the story goes on, it's a happy ending. Like it's just not realistic. And I respect my readers, specifically my teen readers, too much to give them something that is just unrealistic, because I feel like we tend to grossly underestimate what kids period can handle. And so I think that was a big part of the reason why I wanted to make sure that, you know, some of the problematic people make it at the end, some of the heroes do not make it at the end, and I think that is 100% what life is all about as well too.
I have somewhat of a follow-up before. I'm so fascinated by that, because then there's also that element of like, we also don't know what happens to some people. And for you, like, was there ever a moment where you decided, like, did you ever know for yourself more, or did you keep yourself in the mystery as well?
I think at some point when I finished the book, I like went back and wrote myself like a little epilogue, like what would I want to happen type of thing. Because that is something that, you know, I've gotten a lot of feedback about from readers is like, you know, my endings are so like gut, but like, you know, they're so like open-ended. And I'm like, well, yeah, like life is open-ended. Like, you know, we don't have all the answers. But I think in this regard, I wanted to sort of like have that moment. So I wrote a little epilogue for myself, and it's like, you know, maybe like a couple pages. And I, you know, sort of felt like satisfied, like, oh, like, you know, if this was to happen, if I was to add this for the book, like but it never took away and never like, it was just for like myself to kind of like know, like, you know, okay, there is somewhat of a happy ending or somewhat of something that like, you know, people move on. And so I think that was one of the biggest reasons why I do kind of like keep things open, you know. And then when kids always ask, when kids ask me like, you know, oh, is there going to be a part 2? Is there going to be, you know, a sequel and stuff like that? I'm like, you know, this is the opportunity for you to write your own sequel. Like, what would you want to happen? Because I'm never like, no matter what you do, you're never going to satisfy everybody. So what would you like to have happen? And this is like a great like creative writing exercise. Like, what would you like to have happen at the end of the book? Like write your own epilogue and see what happens and see how you feel, or like pass it around to your friends. Like I specifically I love fan fiction for that, for that. I'm a big fan fiction girl, and like even like reading stories on like Wattpad, or like reading other people's like that kind of stuff. I love to see people get creative with work that's already out there.
Well, see, this was gonna be my question, because like the ending just fascinated me. I loved that there are some characters that we definitely know what happened to them, and then there are some characters where we get to imagine what happens to them and make sort of our own ending. But there's one character who appears like mostly off page. Like, I don't want to say how this person appears because I don't want to give anything away. But like, she's a critical person, but we don't ever see her in the action. And I want to know her life story.
Yes.
And so I wondered, like, do you have a prequel or, something planned for this one character?
Oh man.
Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I know. Once you, that would be interesting to sort of like explore her life. You're right. There is a character that is, she's very much a part of the book, but she's not there.
Right.
And that was actually kind of hard to do. And admittedly, like I did kind of want that like bow at the end. But I realized like it once again, it's literally like I'm very economical with my words.
Yeah.
And I'm very economical about like, what I want to happen in some instances. And so I think that was one of those things that like, I maybe I will like, eventually I'm going to post the epilogue that I wrote. Online somewhere. I'm waiting for like the Halloween season to be over, and so people have time and it's not like a huge spoiler. But yeah, maybe I'll post that somewhere so that people can like read it and like sort of be like, oh, okay. Yeah. And like feel good about the whole scenario. Cause I understand that question. Yeah.
You've mentioned this a few times. You do have a background in film and television, and I can like really see this working like as a miniseries. Would you ever consider scripting this or any of your work? And how much of your film and TV brain like is working when you're in the writing process, if at all?
Oh, absolutely. So definitely, I've always been a screenwriter at heart.
Yeah.
And so I definitely follow the Sid Field, like, script writing paradigm, which means that I write in 3-act structures. I, have plot points and midpoints and, the moment of no return type of situation. Like I always I plot everything that way. I'm much more of a plotter than a pantser. I even have this rule, even when I like teach like workshops, I'm like, if you need to reach your first plot point by page 50 of any book that you're writing, if after that, like, you can do whatever you want, but like, if we don't know what's happening by page 50, like, throw the whole book away. So I'm very adamant about like following these sort of like script writing rules, and applying it to whatever I'm writing. So would I, and then to answer your question, would I script this? I would 100%. This is the one book that I feel like I actually can write a script for. All my other books, I don't think I can. And mostly because I feel like those books, one of the elements of like all my books are like very much like my babies, like, like, and one of the things that happens when you turn a book into a movie is like you lose a lot of elements of it. And I love all the elements of all of my books. So I don't want to lose a character. I want every scene to be there. So it's sort of like releasing the reins, and I feel like other people would do a better job. So I'm always like, someone else write this, someone else kind of like take this on. But for this book, I think because I was so I was so passionate about the podcast, and I could see it more. Like I could see the things like I should take out in order to make it the best script possible. So I feel like this is the one book I probably can, but the other ones, I no. Every book that like if anyone wants the option, I'm always like, go ahead.
Sure.
I'm not gonna like argue with you. Whatever you want to take out is totally cool. Like, yeah, I'm a bit more like, especially knowing like the film side and the TV side.
Right.
I'm not too precious about it. Like I know I can't physically do it, but I don't mind other people doing it.
Oh, I can't wait to watch it then.
I know, me too.
Thank you.
Oh, Tiffany, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for joining us. I really love the book.
Thank you so much for having me.
The other book that I read of yours, like, you're right, I am an adult, but fan for life. Like, YA is for adults.
Yes,
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we'll have you back to talk about your next book sometime. For this month's writing prompt, choose a book you've read with an open to interpretation ending. Write an epilogue that takes the ending in one specific direction. Alternately, choose a secondary or off-page character from that book and write a chapter where their story takes center stage. How does the story look different from their perspective? Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Visit writersdigest.com for more writing prompts, advice, and inspiration. Email us at writers.digest@aimmedia.com to share your feedback, and join us on social media at Writers Digest to share your thoughts about The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. We look forward to hearing from you.